Hello and welcome to another installment of our NX Tips and Tricks series. In this video, I'm going to discuss a couple different methods of creating freeform surfaces using ThroughCurveMesh command in NX12. The part we're looking at on the screen here is the one I'm going to start with, and we're going to do a couple different shapes too. But this part is a nearly finished housing for a TV remote control. So this is the kind of surface that we're talking about. It's a contoured surface in multiple directions. So we're going to use a surfacing command to make that outside shape. So I'm going to show you how to use the ThroughCurveMesh command to make this part, the surface that controls the outside shape of the housing. I'm not going to talk about how the details inside the part were created, but I am going to use this model in some other videos that we're going to do. So I might cover some of that later, and I'm also going to show you how some of the other parts for this remote control are made using wave geometry linking in assemblies. So if any of that interests you, you might want to check back and see if any of those videos interest you, if this is the kind of parts that you're modeling. That can be pretty helpful. So before we start modeling the remote control housing, we're going to look at the ThroughCurveMesh command and talk about some of the things that you're going to need to start with before you can make a ThroughCurveMesh surface. So when you get in the ThroughCurveMesh dialog box, the first thing it wants you to select is something called primary curves. So this is going to be construction geometry that you have to draw before you start creating the surface. So I've got some curves out on the screen here. The orange ones are curves that are oriented in the same direction along the length of the object I want to create. The green curves are cross-sectional shapes of what I want that surface to look like as it passes through those different cross-sections. Okay, so if you look at what we got primary curves, and then the next section talks about cross curves. So the problem that some people have with this is trying to decide which ones should be which curves should be cross strings and which curves should be primary strings. And honestly, for most surfaces, it doesn't matter. It creates the exact same surface whether I make the orange strings the primary strings or I make the orange strings the cross strings on this particular shape. Now, there are some times when we get into shapes where it does matter which ones we use for the primary and which ones we use for the cross strings. So we'll talk about that on the next part I'm going to make for you. On this part, though, like I said, it doesn't matter too much. So I'm going to use the orange ones as the primary strings. So something else you want to pay attention to when you're doing this is your selection intent up here, and make sure this is selected to something that is going to work for your strings. Sometimes I use tangent, sometimes I use feature curves. Sometimes I have to use single curve even. So for this one, I'm just going to leave it set how it was. And I'm going to select this as my first primary string. So if you come over here to the dialog box, it's got a list. It says primary curve 1. That's the one I just selected. And when you want to add in the second one, you need to start a new set. So there's a button over here that says add a new set. And I'm going to select the second string and then start another one, add another new set for the third string. All right, so after you're done selecting your primary curves, you're going to come down and switch over to select your cross curves now. And the selection intent changes between the two of them. It goes to whatever you used last time you used this command. So I'm going to change this one to tangent curves. And I'm going to come down here and select this first green section. Then again, I have to add a new set each time I want to go to another section string. So I'm going to add new set. And if you have preview on, which it should be on by default, it will start to show you what your surface looks like once you get the second cross curve selected. After that, you go to add new set, create the last one, and that will show you your entire surface now that I've selected all of the strings that I have for this shape. Okay, so at this point I can hit OK and create this, or I can change some of the settings down below. Now, some of these settings are dependent on whether you have something else drawn already. So the continuity section of the dialog box talks about what the position of these strings or the surface is going to be at the first primary, last primary, first cross and last cross string. So basically all 4 edges of the surface that I've created. So right now it says G0 position. So that's just going to use the cross string or the curve that I used for that edge to control its shape as the shape of it at that edge. Now, if I had some other surfaces drawn, I can pick one of these other options. I can make it tangent to another surface that it comes into contact to at its last primary string, or I can make it what's called curvature continuous, where it tries to continue the shape of the previous surface onto this new surface for a ways before it starts to blend it out and pass through the other section strings that I've got. So sometimes if you're patching something together and you've got multiple surfaces, you could use these options. But for this one, I can't. There's nothing to add it to. Down below, there are some settings, and I'm going to come back and talk to about those in a little bit. One of them says body type solid. That one is a little deceiving. It is not going to create a solid out of this surface that I'm creating right now. What it's doing there is it says if I pick the correct type of construction geometry to close this surface up, it will make it a solid object instead of a surface. If I do not do that, it's always going to default to making a surface. So even though that's checked as solid, it's not going to create a solid right now because this is not a closed body that I'm creating. So anyway, we'll come back and talk about that in a minute. So we hit OK on this and it's created our surface. All right, so another type of shape that we might create is something like this. So one thing I didn't mention before that I want to talk about a little bit now, when you're drawing your section strings and your primary strings, you've got to be really careful about making sure that they touch each other or come within this tolerance of the command. So if we look at the through curve mesh command and go down here to the settings again, tolerance section says intersection, and it says 0.001, so 1,000th of an inch is what these different strings that are coming into contact with each other, they have to be that close to each other within 1,000th of an inch, or it will not create the surface. What I'm going to tell you is it's better that they actually physically intersect each other and they are not off by any kind of distance, because what happens further down the line, if you start to have a surface that was created and the strings were just close enough to make the surface, you'll get problems down the line of creating the solid object that you're going to create this with, or you'll have problems with it using the shell command later. So there's just other things down the line that may have issues because those strings didn't intersect each other and it estimated what the surface was supposed to look like. So be aware of that, and I'm going to talk about a way to do this to draw these strings in a little bit, so I can show you how to make sure that they do actually physically intersect each other. So this part has a little bit different shape than the last one. If you look at how I've got the cross curve set up, the orange ones here, there's not one at the end like there was on the other part. So if we switch back to the other part real quick, you can see I've got cross curves all the way down the length of the part, and on this one I do not. So we're going to have to figure out a way to make that end of that come to the shape that I want. So in through curve mesh, we do have one option of using points for the primary curves. You can only use points on the primary curves. You can't use them on cross curves, and the points can only be at the ends of the object. So you can have 2 points being primary curves, but they can only be the first and or the last primary curve. So on this particular shape, my usual instinct is to make the greens the primary curves, the green strings I have here, but that's not going to work in this case. So I'm going to have to switch and use the orange ones as the primary curves. So I'm going to select this as my first primary curve. This is my second primary curve. This is my third primary curve. This is my fourth primary curve. And then on my last one, I'm going to choose a point. So I'm going to use endpoint, and I'm going to pick the endpoint of that string as my last primary curve. All right, so then we're going to do our cross curves. And with the cross curves, I'm going to change my selection intent to single curve because I need to stop it where that point is. So I'm going to pick this and this as my first first cross curve. And notice how it stopped there. That's because when I drew this curve, this profile, these are two different arcs. So there's a physical intersection of those two arcs there. So I had to have that happen so that it didn't go past that midpoint there. All right, so I'm going to add a new set. My second primary string is going to be this guy, and you can see it starts to make the shape. So we've got half of it drawn. And then my third primary string, and it's giving me an error right now because it says it doesn't connect back here, which that's because I haven't picked the last part of the string yet. As soon as I pick that, it'll go back to having a preview and no error. All right, so there is my surface. So that's a pretty handy feature to have on a part like this where you want this shape to wrap all the way down to the end and you don't want to have that flat planar section down here at the end. Okay, so that's I call that through curve mesh to a point. And again, you can have a point be at both ends or one end or the other, but it has to be in the end. You can't have a point in the middle of your surface. All right, so let's move on now and talk about the part that we started with, that remote control housing, and I'll talk to you about how to make the defining strings that you need and how to tie them together so that they do actually intersect each other and you don't have to worry about any problems down the line or your surface just not being able to be created because your strings don't intersect within the tolerance. So what I usually start with is probably the top profile on a part like this. Again, it's going to depend on what the shape of the part you're creating is, but this profile is what the shape is going to look like looking down on the top of the part. And I'm going to use this to define some things for my other strings in the other directions. So when I start this shape, obviously this is what the profile is going to be. This is going to be another part that comes to a point back here also. So just like the last one we made, one of our primary strings is going to be a point. But after I get this outside shape drawn, and in this part I'm using a spline. Splines are usually again, depends on the shape of the part you're creating and what you need to be able to control. But the splines work best for this because they are one continuous object down the side of this shape that I'm making. So I don't have to worry about where these lines come into contact with them as far as them, if I move something or change the shape a little bit, them coming into contact with a different curve. So like here, there would be a transitional point between this radius and this radius. And if one of my strings moved past that, I would have problems with my surface and my sketch potentially. So anyway, that would be something to think about when you're creating these. What do you have to use to create this? You can create this shape with arcs, but it's a lot more time consuming. And like I said, it might cause trouble with updating things down the line. So anyway, what I've got here is a sketch that controls the profile of my part. These strings that I have that are vertical lines right now, those are going to be for my section locations. So this is going to be to locate the other sketch and to make sure that I have a point that comes into contact with this outer shape that actually physically touches it, that has it doesn't go past it. It's not going to fall within any of that tolerance that we talked about with the through curve mesh intersection tolerance. So if I use that point, I'm going to be able to make sure that it absolutely touches this spline that I've got. There won't be any points on the spline that I can use, and we'll talk more about that when I start making those other sketches or show you what they look like anyway. Okay, so this would be my starting sketch, and like I said, these lines would be where I create my sections. So after I do that sketch, the next step is going to be to create my sections. So the first thing I'm going to need is a plane at each one of these lines that I have in that section. So how I go about doing that, let's go back and turn those off for a minute. Is I go to a datum plane, select that line, and then select another datum plane from my datum coordinate system here, and just make it parallel to it by making it 0 degrees. Okay, and then I do that all the way down for wherever I'm going to put those cross strings. Okay, so that's what I have at this point. I have all those planes. This one was an extra one that I don't really need. Well, actually, I do need that. I know why now. I need that to define this next section. So my next step is going to be to create the side profile of the part. So like I said before, this is the top profile, and this is going to be the side profile of it, or the front view. Again, I'm going to use a spline to create that. That datum plane that I had back here shows me where that other sketch ended, so I know where to end this sketch and come down to that point. I also have a line running down the middle of that sketch that I can use to define that end point. And then also I'm going to put some vertical lines in here and make them collinear to these planes that I just created to locate this other point where the section string is going to have to pass through this profile. So we're basically going to connect the dots here on this line where it intersects this side, this line where it intersects the front, and on this line where it intersects this spline. Because when you're creating those sections, so let's turn on the first one here. This line is technically on the same plane as this sketch when I create a sketch at the end of this part. So is this line. The spline is not, so you will not be able to select any points off of the splines to define where this line has to come into contact. Okay, so when I'm making those sketches, and I'll make a new one for you here on the next one, I pick this plane, start a sketch, and then I have to rotate it a little bit around so I can see what I'm doing. But I draw what my shape is going to be. So on this part, this would be a plastic part that had to have some draft on it. So I would have these lines be angled a little bit. And how you control all this is totally up to you. But I have another arc down here. So I want to make sure that arc is in the middle of my part. So I'm going to pick the center point of it and that datum plane, tell it to be point on curve. Put a radius on there. Put an angle for the draft. So let's make it 5 degrees. That side, I'll make it equal to the other side. So I'll make it equal to P62. So it has the same draft on both sides. And then we can put another radius here so I get a nice rounded shape. And then I can either make these two radii equal or make these two lines equal length. It doesn't matter which one. They're going to accomplish the same thing when constraining the sketch. And then what I usually do is constrain the length of this line instead of constraining this radius, because if you make changes to it, you can make a change where this radius ends up getting too big because of the changing of the width of the part or the height of the part in this direction. So what ends up happening is this intersection point will flip over to the other side. It'll keep the line, but it'll make the radius the same size because you had the radius controlled, and it'll kind of mess up the sketch. So this is the best way I've found to keep that from happening when you make changes to the shape of the part. All right, so you would just continue that process down the part, and on this one I only really have one more to do. But you can see how it makes sure that this string intersects these other profiles that I drew, the top profile and the front profile, perfectly every time if you do it this way. All right, so after that, it's just going to make the surface now. So we go to the surface command, go to your through curve mesh command. Again, the primary curves, I'm going to have one be a point. So this time I'm going to pick that as the first one. So I'm going to come over here, pick that endpoint as the first primary string, go to select the second one. Now, something I didn't tell you last time on the last part I made, you don't always have to go over here and hit this add new set button. If you push down on your middle mouse button, it creates the next one. It skips to the next primary curve. So that's a shortcut. You don't have to be going back and forth all the time. But anyway, this would be my second primary curve, third primary curve, fourth primary curve. And then if I hit the middle mouse button twice between, it'll skip down to the cross curves section. So on cross curves, I'm going to use those two as my first cross curve. That spline is my second. And if I turn it to shaded mode here, you can see that it started to create it. And then my last cross curve will be that side, and that's it. So the last part of this little demonstration is going to be to turn this into an actual solid object, because again, this through curve mesh is not a solid, it's just a surface. So there's a bunch of ways we can do it, but the most effective way that I've found is to create a solid object around it and then trim that solid object to it. So what I usually do is create another sketch on the same plane as the flat part of this surface. And I just draw a rectangle around the part and constrain this end. Since this end of my surface is open, I'm going to make it collinear to that end of the part. And if you want to fully constrain it, you can go ahead and do that. But it doesn't have to have a whole lot of constraints on it. The main part of it is that it's bigger than your surface on the other three sides, and anywhere your surface is open, it doesn't go past it. All right, so there's my rectangle. My next step is going to be to extrude that rectangle. So that it goes, again, past the surface. So it doesn't really matter what the dimension is, because I'm going to trim it back to it in a minute. And then I use the trim body command. And I use the target body as this extrusion I just made. And the tool is going to be this through curve mesh. So I want to flip that around on this part because I want to keep the inside of it. And there's my solid and my through curve mesh. So when you do this method, though, you still have the through curve mesh. It's a construction object now. It's not part of the solid. So you can move it to another layer or hide it, but you do need to keep it because it is part of the creation of this solid. So after that, you can add some more features to it. You can use the shell command to give it a thickness. And start to create the rest of your part and put all the details in it. So hopefully that clears up some things you can do with the through curve mesh command for you guys. And if you have any questions or want to see anything else with it, please leave comments in below. And if you like the video, like it and subscribe. And hopefully this helps you out. And I will do some more videos with this product and kind of show you guys how I would walk through this and make some of the other parts with it using wave geometry linking.